Welcome to the People Dividend podcast. I'm Mike Horne, your host. And today I'm thrilled to be interviewing in our virtual studio, Julian Chender. And I call Julian among one of my passers-by in the organization development community. For all of those in the audience who are in HR, people and culture, organization development, I've always, I think, interacted to the extent that I have at all with Julian Chender as a passerby. And this is an opportunity to get to know Julian because of his impact, his influence in organization development, and to understand what he's doing today with his business 11A Collaborative, which I hope we're going to be able to talk about today. But in the Wayback Machine, Julian Chender's career took root at the National Institutes of Health, and probably in a particular division at NIH, where he was working on response to global crises like Ebola. Which is interesting, Julian, because a company that I worked for there, where I led the human resources for the research organization, was Gilead Sciences, which had a lot of involvement in Ebola and a drug called remdesivir that was later tried to be repurposed for the COVID-19 pandemic. Anyway, so I'm looking forward to talking about that. Julian expanded his impact through external consulting and a position that he had in the Cates Kessler Group at Accenture that was acquired by Accenture. I want to talk a lot about that. I don't think I've ever related this to Julian, given our passers-by status. A part of a project that they worked on, so I'm curious to learn what Julian takes away from that. He is an accredited organization design practitioner, an ICF certified coach, holds the prestigious Emergent Practitioner Award, and has served on influential boards, and now leads 11A Collaborative, where he's facilitating meaningful connections, scalable behavioral change at a global scale. Julian, I'm so glad to be here with you on this episode of the People Dividend. Why don't you say a few words about yourself?
Thanks, Mike. It's so good to be here with you. I've watched so many of these podcasts, so it's nice to be sitting in the chair finally. So I got into org development and org design specifically because I wanted to help people. And straight out of undergrad, I had the marketable skills of reading, writing, and researching. And so it was pretty tough to get a job. And I thought, I want to help people, and I know therapists help people, and so I'll become a therapist. And I went to social work school for about 6 weeks until I realized I was far too immature to be doing this work. And over the course of the next 5 years, found my way into organization development, actually through the Authentic Leadership and Action Institute, the conference in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and ended up at the AU MSOD program, American University Masters of Science in Organization Development, which you did before it was called that, and got my degree there, and then started working at NIAID, so under Tony Fauci during Ebola and Zika. And I say it was the warm-up to COVID because I was doing leadership development, strategic response for the organization as a whole, and team development. And I did hear from one of the scientists who was in one of my leadership development classes that the 11 months she spent working on the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines were possible because she could understand the complexity theory that I taught in that system.
Oh, how interesting.
Some of the biggest impact I've ever had and probably will ever have. So yeah, that was a real shining moment. And then a career in external consulting has been really rewarding because I get to work with a number of different organizations, all in the social impact space.
I've had a lifelong interest in organization development, and probably a near lifelong career in organization development. And I've always been attracted to organization design, though I've never really thought about it as part of my wheelhouse. I mean, I've worked on lots of restructure projects. I just finished one for a client recently, restructuring their research and development team in a big medical device company. But I've never really thought about that in some ways as organization design. And I don't know if you can help me dissect that. why I've had organization design envy as an organization development practitioner. What do you think, Julian?
I'll save the envy for later, but I was having a conversation with a client today about the difference between organization design and organization restructuring. And I think
Uh-huh.
it's a worthy distinction to make.
Ah,
Restructuring for me is a lot about moving people around within an organization. It's usually org chart based, and it's it's about where we sit and how we report and what are the big groupings of work. And organization design is that and more. So organization design is really about the alignment of strategy to structure, which would be those questions in many ways, and then processes and governance, how we actually work across the structure, metrics and rewards, how we incentivize and reward behavior and what we actually measure and focus on, and then talent or people practices, which is a very broad way of saying how do we get the right people in the right seats doing the right things and keep them employed and entertained and all the things they need to be. Engaged would be the word there. So restructuring is a part of an organization design, but I find organization design to be a much more strategic endeavor about, for me at least, marrying strategy to impact. So I work with a lot of organizations that will have a strategic plan or a strategic direction and say, how do we get from there to the actual people's lives we're changing? And my answer is often that organization design is the mechanism by which to do that. And organization design is how we craft the body of the organization that will be delivering on that strategy.
yeah. The one time that I saw it in action, I worked for a big global corporation, and there was some financial activity at the top of the organization that caused them to restructure. And I think it brought together all of those elements that you just described. And I'm wondering if there's an appropriate time to do that. Is it when there is a new executive? Is it when there's been an inflection point? I mean, what prompts that kind of intervention?
Often it's a new strategy.
Uh-huh.
We want to get into a new market, we have a new product, we want to scale our impact in one direction or another. It's a question about having a new direction the organization is headed. It doesn't have to be all new, but new enough that the fundamental design of the organization is not going to support the new direction it's headed. And that can be a question of both scaling up and scaling back. So when we think about restructurings in terms of layoffs and cost cutting, that's also a strategic question. I think when it's done without the strategy in mind, it can be very damaging to an organization because you're not thinking about what you're cutting and why. You're thinking about what you're cutting because it's expensive. And then the growth trajectory is what can we afford at what stage of our growth to really build this organization that's going to deliver on the promise of the strategy.
It's such a contrast. When I started early in my consulting career, not when I started it, I worked for a productivity improvement consulting firm. It was a big global firm at the time. And they would promise clients a 3-to-1 return on investment. So for every $1 million of services they bought, the client would recognize $3 million in savings. And of course, all of that was achieved by labor reductions. I mean, I say that lightly now, but I mean, certainly. And that business was able to pivot itself to different parts of the world at different moments in, depending on where economies were looking for to increase profitability by reducing labor costs. And that's not the kind of organization design, that's restructuring as you see it, right?
Well, when you're thinking about actually offshoring, it's called a global business services or global business solutions. It's thinking about where we can take our HR or finance or legal capability
Oh, right.
in the country and actually build a hub that is going to serve. And this is often in very large multinational organizations where that's going to serve the whole organization. So
right.
In the last organization I worked in, U.S. legal was in Buenos Aires.
Yeah. Yes, I've seen. I mean, having like consulted and worked in and led teams in a number of big global corporations, there's so many variants of form and function that often exist, and um, it's interesting how all of those tie together. But when you, what made you transition from a large consulting firm to 11A? I mean, what are you interested in now? What are you leading there? What are you thinking about?
I'm thinking about how to do organization design, which for me is really about designing behavior at scale in the
Right.
social impact space. So for nonprofits, for social enterprises, for public offices and government agencies. And I thought about what I was doing in my former career as great org design work, but it wasn't always for companies I believed in or whose mission I could get behind.
Right.
And so I thought I had this moment where I thought if my headstone says Julian did great org design work and fundamentally helped the rich get richer, or the other headstone could say Julian did great org design work and helped people doing good in the world do it better, I had a pretty clear choice. And the mechanism by which I can do the social impact work because of the cost basis and everything that's much lower is through my own consulting company, 11A Collaborative. And the theory behind
See.
11A Collaborative is that it's about creating healthy society through healthy organizations, which to me is very much an org design philosophy, that the
Hmm.
organization is the mechanism by which we can create change.
Hmm. I mean, I would like to get into a little bit about what is a healthy organization. I mean, I mean that implies a certain set of biases, and
Absolutely. From the point of view of organization design, it's about alignment.
hmm,
It's about alignment of the parts towards the strategic goal. So for me, it's based on contingency theory, the idea that there's no one right answer for an organization. So a lot of times I'll get requests for benchmarking. How are our competitors doing it? How are our friends doing it? And I think that's a really interesting philosophical and intellectual question, but it's not going to serve you because it doesn't matter what they're doing because they have a slightly different strategy and therefore need a slightly different organization. So the question of alignment is all goes back to strategy. And for
hmm,
social impact, it goes back to the strategy of creating the impact you want to create in the world.
hmm,
So one of the last organizations I worked with was a 6,000 person nonprofit in California that did expanded learning. So summer education, after school education, before school education, enrichments programming in the public schools in California, mostly LA and South. And they were growing. And the question was, how do we grow our impact while growing our organization in a sustainable manner? So the organization design was to reach more children, was fundamentally to serve more kids in California. And to me, that meant a lot. It meant about how do we align our structure in a way that we can have multiple regions? How can we organize geographically in a way that's both meaty enough and sizable, but manageable? So how do we group our school districts? That was a fundamental question around alignment. The other question was, well, if we want to double our impact, what else needs to double in size? And so then the question was, do we need to double our processes or can we streamline our processes? What is mandated by the government of California for reporting and what is internal and what do we want to invest in and what don't we want to invest in? So org design is a lot about trade-off decisions, but it's based on the unique situation of each organization. And it's about aligning the different parts of the organization for their unique circumstances. And I think always back to open systems theory, that these are all organizations in conversation with the world around them. So I do the internal alignment, and then there are those people doing the external alignment that I quite respect and appreciate their work there as well.
and I mean, what are some of the common challenges? I mean, that organizations. I mean, I think it's difficult to. I mean, I think the easiest way to say, what do all organizations have in common, is to borrow from Jeff Pfeffer, where he said that, all organizations go out of business at some time, they cease to exist. And that's what's common about organizational experience. And therefore, when you see, 100-year-old brands, 125-year-old brands, organizations that, so what do you think, regardless of sector, or maybe it is, in regard of sector, however you want to answer that. What are some of the common challenges for organization design? I know that strategy often seems to be a catalyst, I mean, from our conversation. But so what are some of the common challenges?
I think
Or what challenges are common? Maybe that's the question.
I think the first challenge for any organization is understanding, this is a very famous quote that is somehow unattributable, but understanding that your organization is designed to get the results it's getting.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the first hurdle for any organization seeking organization design services, is understanding that it's already been designed.
Mm-hmm.
It might not have been intentionally designed. It might have been a startup that grew organically and just reached a certain level, but it has assumptions baked into it. It has culture baked into it. It has a structure, whether explicit or implicit. It has processes, whether followed or not. It has everything that we are doing in a design already. So I think the common challenge for any organization is understanding that it's already designed and then taking the intentional look at how to do that.
It's interesting your example to think about it, because I'm in the fortunate position where I coach founders, people in the C-suite. And one of my engagements last year with the board and founder was someone who, has built a very successful business around himself, was knew how to raise capital in excellent ways, and built a household name business in a very, very short period of time. And, when the market began to soften, in comes new managers or new management teams. And of course, they're at odds because there are purpose and strategy questions, which would be a good time, right? Maybe for an org design discussion?
Absolutely, because your external environment is changing, which means your strategy
Mm-hmm.
has. Absolutely. I think so much of design is about fit. And it's about fit with the external environment and fit with the internal environment. And strategy is the link between the internal and the external. So thinking always about where are we going, why are we doing it, and how do we want to get there? I think it's a question that people talk about but don't actually sit down and think about to the extent that would serve them all the time.
Right. Hey, I think part of this is maybe it's an ontological difference, maybe it's an epistemological difference, I'm not sure. In terms of, when I think about structure, I come at it from sort of an old Marv Wise board 6-box model of structure. Essentially answers the question about how to, what's the division of task? Mm-hmm. Can you answer that question? So often, as an organization development expert who is accustomed to working out of an engineering mentality, finding a problem to be fixed, and hopefully making an improvement on it, that has always resonated with me. And I guess, for me, it's how do I lift my head up a little further and see design or architecture as something broader than that. And perhaps it's just another diagnostic framework. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, so my diagnostic framework is Galbraith's STAR model.
Right, yeah. Yes.
And that
you explained that, just shortly a while ago, right?
And that would suggest that everything ladders up to strategy, and specifically the capabilities that will allow us to enact the strategy. And by capabilities, I mean those organization-wide muscles that are going to make us competitive or make us deliver on our impact promise or whatever the thing is you want to do. For restructuring, structure is a part of that. For the division of task from the 6-box model, I think from Galbraith's STAR model, I'm thinking about structure from the point of view of where we get leverage and scale. Where can we actually group work strategically? Not so much so that there's clear division of labor or task, but so that there's actually a proper investment in a certain direction that ladders up to strategy. So the big structural components that you can choose from, for the most part, are to be customer centered, to be functionally aligned, to be product driven, to be geographically dispersed. And then what I would add to that is always, for social impact, a question of impact area. So for the nonprofits who are working across areas of expertise, for those social enterprises who are working across those, what are those areas in which you're working? Is it abortion rights? Is it the environment? Questions like that can be another design lever for structure. But those are the big groupings that tell you how you're going to meet your clients in a certain way. Function design will give you great deep expertise. If you need to bring expertise, you want to be designed by function. If you want to meet your clients exactly where they are and give them anything they need, you want to be client organized. If you have very distinct client groups, that makes a huge difference. But what you see in a lot of multinationals is that they'll do two of those, and they'll matrix an organization across geography and product. So for instance, Pepsi, it has a product and a geography orientation. So my favorite example of this is that the potato chips I buy from Frito-Lay's when I go to a music festival with my wife in Switzerland are paprika flavored. But I can't get those same chips in the United States because there's a local flavor that is, what the customer wants. So that's a geographic design. But then there's the product, which is the potato chip, which is fundamentally that potato chip is constructed in the same way and through the same process, just in a different location with a different flavor added.
I'm familiar with those paprika flavored chips. I mean, having spent 5 years at Roche and Basel, I know that particular crisp. Julie, what I'm curious about, I mean, in addition to everything that's so intriguing that you're offering, is what are the risks of an organization that 11A works with if they don't engage in this kind of work? I mean, it seems to me a lot of organizations for social impact often can't get to their mission because of a funding crisis or funding event, or resources so scattered and scarce. So what's some of the compelling rationale for all of this great work?
Well, I'll answer that question, but I'll give an example of something else first that I think might be a lead.
Wonderful.
You talk about scarce resources, and I actually find scarce resources to be a very, very good design challenge. So scarce resources for me is a question of how do we work within the constraints, and design is best done with clear and articulable constraints and a clear problem to solve within those constraints. The one design I did that really failed was an organization, a nonprofit arts organization that didn't have constraints. It had a patron who wrote multiple blank checks for it. And it didn't have a way to make trade-off decisions because they had the money to do it all. So actually, scarcity is a time to double down on organization design, to think about what is the way we can meet our mission and make our impact with the resources that we have. Whereas too many resources can become a question of wanting to have it all and therefore getting almost nothing done. It comes back to the question of alignment. How do we align to what we have? How do we align to the current reality? How do we align to the external environment rather than how do we just build for the sake of building? And some nonprofits are started by really charismatic founders that need to transition. That's a really good time. Some nonprofits have huge growth in funding. Mackenzie Scott grants can be, 10 to 20 times the size of the budget of the organization. And knowing how to implement an organization growth strategy with the design that will scale over time with, $20 million on a $500,000 budget is going to make a big difference. So there's a lot of questions about growth of impact as well as scarcity.
How about a memorable success story?
One of my favorite successes is actually not at a nonprofit, but at a Fortune 10 organization where the C-suite didn't have clear choices about their strategy. They had a very nice strategy, but when it came down to what were the trade-offs they were willing to make, it wasn't quite clear, which meant that the org design was reliant on whims rather than investment choices and clear investment choices. And to get a Fortune 10 C-suite aligned on strategic choices that numbered in about 10 to 12 was one of the biggest accomplishments of my career. And what it did was it made all of the organization design from the top down so much more clear and so much more actionable and able to expand and grow. And so when I work with social impact organizations, I always go back to those questions of like, what are those big strategic choices? We then called them mega choices because they outnumbered everything else. They kind of outclassed everything else that was a choice. So what are those stakes in the ground? And getting those clear will help you with the design. And so that was a success because everything was able to be designed according to those stakes in the ground.
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's always been something rewarding and memorable about working for social impact organizations, whether it's the consultation work I did at the YWCA of Oakland, or that had any number of issues, work at the American National Red Cross, or my work with the American Foundation for the Blind in Manhattan, really working on strategic impact in disability communities that in many ways are so fractured and so strained for resources, though AFB, American Foundation for the Blind, I mean, with their relationship with the U.S. government on books for the blind, I mean, and Helen Keller and Annie Sullivan's tremendous financial vision. I mean, they were an organization, and one that had, perhaps still does, a number of interesting leadership challenges in that their constitution or bylaws or some governance document had that the CEO or the chief executive would be both hearing and sight impaired, which made for a very limited pool of talent. So it's thinking about all your elements of, Galbraith and Starr and thinking about that. And yet the impact, I think, can be quite significant in this social world and what you're doing in terms of designing behaviors at scale.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful story. I didn't know that.
No, it's fascinating work that you do. And like I said, at the beginning of our discussion, our interview, I've always had envy around sort of organization design. I mean, I've read I had tons of these, I think, at one time, designing dynamic organizations. I did work with Diane and Amy at one point, very briefly, on a project at a very big company. So, Julian, so great. I'm so glad about what you're doing with 11A Collaborative. If people wanted to get in touch with you, how would they do that? I mean, we'll put it in the show notes so people will have it, but talk a little bit about accessing you and your work.
Yeah, so I post regularly on LinkedIn. 11A Collaborative has its own page, and then I have my own page. 11acollaborative.com is my working website, and you can reach me at julian@11acollaborative.com.
Oh, that's great. I've got to ask the origin story for 11A.
It's named after my grandmother's apartment number.
Oh, okay. Good. All right, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Julian Chender. It's been a delight to have you on the People Dividend. And if you were going to give people, our listeners, as we sort of wrap up 2025, 2024, getting ready for 2025, what would you encourage in terms of design thinking?
I think the thing of the moment is how to manage fear and all that's going on in our polycrisis world with strategy, and then make the design choices. So a lot of the organizations I'm working with are looking at big questions like economic mobility in America, and it's very dependent on the election. And I advise them to think about what they can do now, what they can do regardless of the election results, and to think about then what are the design choices they need to make. So to go from big picture, which can be kind of scary, to your realm, which can be a little bit more controlled, and then into the design choices would be my last piece of advice.
Well, again, thanks. It's been great to have Julian Chender as a guest on the People Dividend. And until the next episode, everyone, stay well.